Okay, so I think it's been a couple of weeks since we met, perhaps. So there's been quite a bit that's happened, including maybe even a minor core release since the last time that this particular meeting was held. So I wanted to share my deck from last week as well, 2 weeks ago rather. So this will cover essentially the last month's worth of updates. But I'll go through the one from 2 weeks ago really quickly, and we can pause for any questions. So feel free to interrupt as I go through these. But I'm going to start with this update from 2 weeks ago, just because, like I said, I think it's been so long since this particular meeting has happened. So first of all, I was bringing everybody up to speed a couple of weeks ago on all the releases that we've had. This has been the most aggressive release timeline that we've seen from Core after the 8.3.x release a couple of months ago. So 2.1.1 came out 19 April. And when I say kind of Core is what drives the releases of Lightning. We always release from Core releases because we still support that legacy tarball. And we want to make sure that everything works and all our patches still apply. So we always release from Core releases. So 19 April was a Core security release, plus some features in Lightning. And then 20 April, the day after, was a hotfix release from Lightning because of a mistake in our dependency tree. And then 3 May, which was 2 weeks ago, was another Lightning and another Core patch release with a couple of features and bug fixes. So I'll go over those quickly. 2.1.3, we added some console commands that might be helpful to some people. Probably not so much in PS because you're all using BLT, but for people that are using Lightning outside of BLT, generating bhat config can be kind of a challenge. So we added a couple of Drupal console commands. Was that a question? I guess not. So those are documented in our Lightning project Travis file. That's probably the easiest way to see it. They're documented in our README file, but an actual real life example, our Lightning project, Travis.yaml file. This is a simple bug that we fixed in the media library. Updating panels, Panelizer, and Page Manager to stable releases. That was pretty seamless. But I think that, getting those to a stable release and using layout discovery and everything was kind of a milestone that we wanted to hit. Something that's kind of interesting and definitely affects PS is this bug where Lightning could interfere with config sync. So I wanted to go into just a little bit of detail about that. Basically, Lightning does a lot of configuration manipulation when certain components are enabled. So, for example, when you enable the workflow component of Lightning, it takes the admin content view, which is actually provided by Node, the Node module in Core, and makes some changes to it. It adds like a column for workflow status and, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 other things. So it does that in an install hook. And what we found was that if that module is being enabled because of a config sync, so follow this, this chain of events. If you have a development environment and you enable Lightning workflow in it, it runs its install hooks and modifies config as it sees necessary. Then you export your config. So now you have config exported that says that Lightning workflow should indeed be enabled. And you also have config that represents the changes that Lightning workflow has made to your other config. And then you push that up to a dev environment or a test environment or a prod environment even. And what it does is during the config sync, it enables Lightning workflow. And then from the config, it grabs that config that had been defined. But then Lightning, again, was trying to rewrite that config as it saw necessary. And it shouldn't, because that config is already represented in your config export in that case. So after a lot of back and forth and some help from PS and some help from Alex Pott, we figured out that in our install hooks, basically, what we need to do is bail out at a certain point if we detect that configuration is syncing. So what we do in all of our install hooks now is essentially do stuff that we always should do, then detect whether or not this is part of a configuration sync, and that's why this is being enabled, and if so, bail out. If not, then continue on and do the other configuration stuff that you would want to do. So it's kind of an interesting exercise there, and so that's all been rewritten. So 2.1.4, this is stuff that we were planning a couple of weeks ago, but I'll update in our next one. There were a couple of other interesting issues. I attempted to make standard the base profile for Lightning as kind of an exercise, and we actually got blocked on excluding config. So we can exclude components easily, obviously, with our core patch, but we can't exclude configuration. So Lightning provides its own search functionality using Search API. So obviously we want to exclude core search, but standard tries to install it, but that's no problem. We exclude the dependency. And what happens is during install, we get an exception because there's some configuration provided in standards config install directory regarding search. And we don't have any way to exclude that. So that might be a follow-up to the core patch. That might be a patch to core that says standard should be a little bit more lenient with its config and maybe put it in optional or something like that. But anyway, that's not something we can do right now. And there was some good reason behind trying to make Lightning inherit standard. Ron and I talked about this a little bit. It was an interesting conversation. One of our tenets is offloading stuff. Don't do media on your own. Let Lightning do it, even if you're a distribution. Just kind of offloading these things to other things. So to kind of practice what we preach, Lightning shouldn't really be creating basic page or things like that. We should offload that to standard if we can. So we'll continue to work that, but right now it's not possible. There were a couple of other interesting issues that looked interesting, but ultimately we were unable to reproduce. One had a really scary title, New Subprofile System is Broken. I worked through that issue with the reporter, and I think it was configuration dependency issues that he was having. Although there may be another small issue with that subprofile patch that we're working on. But ultimately, those other ones were unable to be reproduced. So I also kind of real high level outlined stuff that Lightning wants to get done prior to Core 8.4. One of the things that we've already done is migrate to layout discovery from the layout plugin. So that was kind of our first proof of concept, moving from Contrib to something that's in Core. Of course, on deck are also media and workbench moderation to content moderation. But that was kind of our first proof of concept, and that went well. That config sync that we covered in the earlier slides, we're already done with. Inline blocks for landing pages we've been talking about for quite a while, and I have an update in my next deck about that. What kind of an interesting one is support user stories with field layout where possible. So we found that now that field layout is in Core, we're not aggressively trying to move to that because it is very much experimental, unlike layout discovery, which is marked experimental, but we have the maintainers working for us, and they give us the assurance that it is indeed stable. And I'm sure that layout discovery is as well. Field layout. But basically, we see some overlap with what field layout provides and with what Panelizer provides. After a little bit more investigation, it doesn't seem like they fully cover our user story, so we probably won't be doing this, but stuff like providing a default layout you can do largely with field layout now. The problem is you can't do stuff like custom blocks. You can only do stuff that are fields within the actual entity. So that's kind of a deal breaker. The other thing was you can't provide more than one default layout for editors because those layouts are tied directly to a view mode and editors can't change view modes. But we're still exploring that. We have some ideas about the view modes and how we might be able to accomplish that, but that's probably not something that we'll do prior to 8.4. It was just more of an exploratory thing. And then again, the migration to media and migration to content moderation. So that was actually all from 2 weeks ago. And I have an update for today for the last 2 weeks. But I'll pause here just for a minute to see if anybody has any questions or comments. Great. So 2.13 was released last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry. I think we just covered that mostly. Today, we'll release 2.14. We expect a core security release. If that doesn't happen, we won't release 2.14. We expect that to happen today. So we have a couple of bug fixes in the UX fix. This is only a 2-week sprint, so there's not a whole lot in this, but we'll cover what is. So a small bug with create new revision checkbox. We were assuming incorrectly that all node content would be moderated and therefore would automatically create new revisions, or the create new revision checkbox would be disabled, which is what workbench moderation and content moderation do, so we hide it. But of course, some people have content that indeed is not moderated or content types that aren't moderated. So we shouldn't be hiding that checkbox in that case. We fixed that. Some improvements to the media entity browser UX. So this is the entity browser that appears when you have a field reference to a piece of media. So you have a piece of content that references Instagrams or tweets or both or images or something like that. We made a couple of improvements. One, when cardinality is set to greater than 1 but less than unlimited, We already had some nice UX where you could select up to the number that were allowed, and then the other ones would gray out. You'd have to deselect one in order to select another. We kind of improved on that even a little bit more and say specifically the number total that you can select and the number that you have selected so far, so it's clear to the editor, because it's not the editor doesn't necessarily know how many they could select in that situation. So now we just print that out for them and show them that, hey, you selected 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3, and then ultimately 3 out of 3. And when 3 out of 3 happens, we hide the selection and just show what's selected. We've also moved what's selected into its own very clear area that has a label that says this is what's selected. If you remove one of those from the selected items, your library shows back up and you can continue selecting things. So those are suggestions that came out of our quick UX meeting with Acqua's UX team. This was another interesting config problem that we came across, or PS really came across. So Lightning ships with some default config that is run on install and then ignored after that. And what we realized, obviously, is that that config can become out of sync with what the modules are providing on a clean install or via their update hooks. One example was config relating to layouts, view displays and form displays rather. They added a key. And I think maybe at the worst case, it threw a couple of notices, but this could cause larger problems, obviously. We think that, ideally, if it did cause larger problems, it would be caught by our test case, our test scenarios. I guess my phone is now. Sorry about that. I didn't even know my phone was able to accept calls on my computer. Anyway, we would expect that to be caught by our test suite, but obviously we don't want to rely on that. We'd rather get out ahead of it. So what we ultimately want to do is detect changes to config that reflect, and to be clear, one solution would be just to re-export Lightning's config every time we updated a module. But the problem with that is Core's configuration system makes assumptions about kind of hard dependencies between things. So if we had Lightning Layout and Lightning Workflow enabled, the content types provided by Lightning Layout would have a hard dependency on Lightning Workflow because they have Workbench moderation enabled on them. But that's not necessarily the case, and our config doesn't represent that. So we've kind of hand curated a lot of this config. So just simply re-exporting it wouldn't work. So the solution was to make a complete export of Lightning's config after a clean install and store that in basically a test directory inside of our VCS next to our database fixtures. And now our install target from Thing will re-export that config, and we'll use Git to detect any changes to it. If and when there is a change to that config, we'll have to manually correlate that to the active config, or the config that's actually used during install over in Lightning itself, and manually make those changes. But anytime there's ever a change to any of this config, it'll show up now in our Git commits, and we'll have to manually correlate that and fix it. So we should be able to stay out in front of any config changes going forward. So another interesting issue that came up that I was really surprised hadn't come up before was scheduling updates for translatable entities. So we use the scheduled updates module to schedule updates to the Workbench moderation or moderation field on content type. So we ship with basic page, being able to do that. And what we found out is if that target entity is translatable, so if you have a basic page in English and Spanish, scheduled updates will only ever work on the site's default language, no matter what you do with the config. And we dug into the code a little bit, and it's very clear why that's happening. By the time it gets to the update runner, it's just loading a dumb entity by ID. It has no information about translation whatsoever there. So we talked to Ted, the maintainer of that module, or the developer of that module, and kind of outline what needed to happen. That's all that roadmap's outlined in that issue. It's pretty significant. A new update runner, some serious config changes to Lightning if we wanted to support it out of the box, and quite a bit of work. So the roadmap's outlined, but we haven't prioritized it yet. This was brought up by, I think, Adam Weingarten. He had come across it. I know there's been at least 1 or 2 other people that have said that, yeah, it would be helpful. But we haven't, we're actually surprised that we haven't heard more about this. So if this is something that affects you, I would say chime up in that issue queue or let me know personally, and we can try to get this work prioritized. So we have a roadmap, but it's not currently in any of our sprints. It's a pretty significant amount of work. So an update on inline blocks. We've been talking about these for a long time. I think we all kind of understand what the concept is. This is if you have create content. Well, it's really kind of this almost API level thing where we can make these entities that emulate other entities without actually saving them to the database. But that was all work towards being able to create content in the context of a landing page and not have it show up as a system block that can be used elsewhere. So a couple of patches have been filed. There's a proof of concept in Page Manager. I think that there's a pending patch against Panelizer for a proof of concept that's waiting on review from the maintainers over there. So given that our next sprint isn't super short again, or the next release cycle isn't super short again, I think that we can hopefully target this for finally getting into Lightning, and definitely by the end of quarter. Although it's one of these things that's really dependent on the maintainers of those modules, everybody kind of coming into agreement. So it's hard to put hard dates on these, but good progress being made. And finally, we talked to PS about, well, I think the meeting was initially about panels and Panelizer, and I don't really want to dive too much into that, but there's some good updates from the layout team about what's in the works for field layouts in 8.5 and Panelizer around that same time. And I think the big news about field layouts was the ability to place arbitrary blocks via field layout. So again, right now you can only place fields that are on the actual entity that you're modifying. So you can place the body over here and some other field over here, but you can't place recent content over here. But that's the goal. And once that happens, there's going to be a lot more overlap with what Panelizer does in core. And that's when Lightning can start to look at solving some of those user stories via field layout instead of Panelizer. I hinted before that one of the problems was that even if that was solved, the ability to allow editors to select from a set of predefined layouts still wasn't part of field layout. But we thought about some ways to work around that. And one we thought might be to expose to the editor a select box to change the view mode, which is just a config entity that sits over there. So in theory, we could expose that to the editor using field layout, but that would be pretty far off. This probably wouldn't be work that we'd be looking at until sometime around the new year. And then the other thing that was demoed, and I'm not involved in this, but some great people is building layouts by placing multiple layouts on a page. So that's what these two screenshots kind of show. I think first off, they show moving the IPE into the settings tray over here. And then they show basically the ability to create layouts by placing multiple layouts onto a page. So I think in the example on the right there, we basically have a 3-column layout, which is great, but they're also adding the ability to create another layout on top and another layout below that. So you can effectively build custom layouts that way. And then, in theory, place anything that you could currently place with the in-place editor there. But that stuff, again, targeted for 8.5, which would be next spring sometime. So 2 updates in one. That was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me. Are there any questions or other topics that you guys wanted to cover?
I have one point, Alan. In beginning of June, all the EMEA TA will be all together in Reading. We will have one day dedicated to MBO, and we did vote basically. And part of the task will be to contribute to Lightning or to modules which are useful to Lightning. So we are looking for tasks which can be achieved, or at least do a good progress in one day for 2 or 3 people. So it's in 3 weeks from now. So it gives us some room to investigate which tickets, but it's probably good to have it in mind.
That's excellent. That's really good to hear. One thing that comes to mind is the scheduled update support for translated entities. That's something that with 3 smart people in a room for a day could probably tackle, and there's a roadmap for it. But let's coordinate. I guess we'll be meeting again in 2 weeks anyway. But yeah, for sure, that's great. That's good to hear. Thank you.
I will send you an email just to be sure that it's right and somewhere. But there is no emergency at all, and maybe the things will change. I mean, the tickets and the priority will change on Lightning since from beginning of June. So maybe we will discuss it more the day before.
Great. Yeah, definitely. That sounds awesome. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay. Anything else? All